While we're waiting for everybody to come in at the last minute, of course, left it far too late. Can I get a show of hands to find out sort of who we've got in the room? Okay. How many front-end developers do we have in the room? Wow, there's a lot of you. Okay, for the record, just because I found out apparently it's an Australian thing, I refer to front-end developers as fenders. Just thought I'd teach you all that today. We're trying to make it a thing. Any back-end developers? Isn't this the same people? Any designers? Don't be ashamed. I appreciate designers. They can do a lot of work that I can't do. Any full stack developers? You guys are all lying, but that's a completely different talk. That's not the one I'm going to give today. Okay. So we're waiting. Everybody shuffle in nice and close, making new friends with everybody else that they're sitting near. Thank you, everybody, for coming along to my session this afternoon. My name is Amy. I'm here to talk about CSS Grid. If this wasn't what you were expecting, now would be the time to really quickly leave the room. However, I will warn you, you're going to miss a spectacular session if you do. So a little bit about myself. I come from Perth in Australia. Yeah, all the way down there in the bottom. I came all this way, however, not quite as far as the last conference, which was in Minnesota. So this 20 hours, absolute breeze. I'm really enjoying my time in Norway though. This is my first time here. You've got a fantastic country, a fantastic city, but I'm just not sure about it. That was 10 o'clock last night. I'm all for sunshine, but this is just taking it a little bit too far. So I'm a freelance front-end developer, which means that I spend most of my time either at the beach or working at home in my pajamas. I'm really heavily involved in the Perth tech community. In fact, there's a couple of us in the audience today, which is really exciting. We all travelled a really long way. I help run a user group for front-end developers, which is called Fenders, and I'm on the committee for the DDD Perth conference, as well as working for a conference called Yale Conferences, which runs tech conferences in Australia, Singapore, and Hong Kong. I also have a gorgeous grey and white border collie who likes to sit next to me when I work from home and who got very upset when I finally had to get my suitcase out over the weekend, so missing him a little bit while I'm here. And today, I'm here to talk about CSS Grid, which if you haven't heard of it, you've obviously missed Lemon's talk earlier, and well, that's your loss. It's a spec that came to browsers a few years ago, and it's revolutionized the way we can do layouts on the web. But to start off today, I want to tell you a little story. In the beginning, there was darkness and emptiness. And then Tim Berners-Lee said, "Let there be internet." The internet was much simpler in those days. It was just HTML content on a page, similar to how we'd see in a Word document. But pretty soon, everybody got sick of looking at Times New Roman. And so Tim said, let the fonts and colours and sizes and positions be changeable. And then there was CSS. But before too long, this wasn't good enough either. We wanted to do more. We wanted more control about how our websites looked. And it was really great because then we discovered that you could use tables for layout. This was really great because you could break your page up into a grid and you could merge cells together and you could embed tables inside tables. We finally had control over how our content was being laid out on a page. But pretty soon we discovered, although tables inside tables was okay, before too long we had tables inside tables, inside tables, inside tables, inside tables. And that was a little bit less fun. It also made it more difficult when we started trying to make our websites responsive and work on different device sizes. And so we were often having to completely recreate a website built for mobile as it was for desktop. And we were just duplicating all the work we did. But it was really great because then we discovered you could use floats. This was a step in the right direction because we were back to following the separation of concerns principles, which says that HTML is for your content and CSS is for how the content looks and feels on a page. But before too long, we found that floats also weren't working this morning. They weren't working as well. And again, if you saw Lemon's talk, he had a wonderful picture representation of how floats really work. You had to clear fix everything. You had to use a bunch more container divs to keep floating elements together, to keep them apart. When you had media queries, you often had to do complex calculations or reset your previous code. And there was a lot of having to use important tags. So by the time we'd memorized how many percent wide an element needed to be in a 6-column grid with a 1% margin, we were pretty excited to have Flexbox come along. We didn't have to do percentage math anymore. It reduced the number of media queries we needed, and we were now finally able to center content easily again, something we hadn't been able to do since tables. We were finally starting to get the functionality we needed from our CSS. We no longer needed to write complicated code to work with percentages, and our websites were now more responsive than ever. But although Flexbox was really great for flowing content, there was limited control on the cross-axis. Having gaps between the items tended to get a little bit complicated. You often had to use negative margins. But things were looking up. We finally had a CSS technology that was built for layout. And in the distance, we could see the cavalry on its way. In 2017, CSS Grid launched in all new major browsers pretty much at the same time. This was something we'd never seen happen before. And this gave us something we'd been asking for from our CSS layouts. Like Flexbox, we were able to define a set of constraints and have the browser make the layout responsive. But we now had more control over both directions. With Grid, we were able to define areas of a layout. We were able to define whether or not specific elements spanned multiple areas. We could dictate how the elements inside a grid behaved. We could reduce the code that we were writing, which apparently is a bad thing because our job satisfaction is whether or not we're writing more lines of code. And even better, we could reduce the thinking needed to make our layout responsive. But everybody started asking the question, well, isn't this just what we already had with tables? Isn't Grid just a newer, fancier version of the table layout we'd been scoffing at for years? No. CSS Grid is specifically built for creating layouts. It's designed for this use rather than tables, which we used as a hack. Now, don't get me wrong, tables still have a place. I don't believe they're necessarily evil. They're just a little bit misunderstood and misused. Tables still have a place in our HTML, but it's for data or something you would expect to see in a table, not for your layout. CSS Grid is also again bringing us back to our separation of concerns principles, which is where CSS is where we're defining how it looks and feels, and HTML is for content only. CSS Grid has also helped us to write more semantic and logical HTML. We no longer need to write our HTML based on how the page design looks. We can write it based on the logical flow of the document and let CSS rearrange it visually where needed. When this is done right, it means that our content can be more accessible to anybody who's using reader mode, saving an article for later, or using a screen reader or assistive technology. And to prove all of this today, we're going to build a layout of an app, because with CSS Grid, mocking up and building the layout of an app not only takes less time, it takes less code. So today we're going to build a notebook app. We've got a basic HTML structure to work with, and we know what we want the layout to look like. I also want to note that this is a semantic HTML structure. There are no extra container divs. This is just pure semantic HTML. So we know what happens next, right? This is a bit where we spend hours fighting with it, and we've got to rearrange our HTML to get the layout to work properly, right? Let's see what happens. So we've got our HTML. Doesn't really look like much yet. The first thing we're going to do is apply display grid to our body. And that does nothing. Looks exactly the same. Next, we're going to define the columns and rows of our grid, so how wide and how tall it's going to be. So we're going to have a look at our wireframe again. And ignoring the fact that I clearly cannot draw and the fact that I did this on a plane did not help in any way, we're pretending that these are 5 equal width columns, a fixed height header, a fixed height footer, and the center to take up whatever room is left over. So we'll go through and do the columns first. So 5 columns wide. To do that, we're going to use grid template columns. And so say we're going to define 200 pixels, 200 pixels, 200 pixels, 200 pixels, 200 pixels. That was 5, right? This is pretty easy, but it's a lot of code to write. And like, what if we've got a 10 column wide grid? That's getting a bit excessive. So CSS Grid gives us access to the repeat function. So we can instead just go 5, 200 pixels. The repeat function allows us to define the number of times to repeat something and then the size that we're repeating. So 3 200 pixels would give us 200 pixels, 200 pixels, 200 pixels. We can also define a pattern to repeat. For example, we can say repeat to 10 pixels, 20 viewport widths, which would give us 10 pixels, 20 viewport widths, 10 pixels for 20 viewport widths. Try saying that 10 times quickly. The great thing about the repeat function is we're able to use whatever units we want to. That can be pixels, ems, rems, viewport widths, viewport heights, percentage, anything goes. But remember, we said these were 200 pixel wide columns. So this gives us a fixed size grid, and we don't really want to. We want there to always be 5 columns, even if there's different device sizes. So we can say repeat 5, 20%. 5 columns equal width. If I've done my math right, that's pretty sure it's 100%. But Grid also gives us access to something else new, just the FR unit. Now, the FR unit works similar to Flexbox, if you're familiar with that, and for a lot of the time will replace where we're using %. It's a little bit difficult to explain, so I'm going to show you an example here where we're defining grid with grid template columns of 100 pixels, 1 FR, 50 pixels, 2 FR. We also want to have a gap between each of those columns of 20 pixels. I'm going to touch more on the gap later. So what the FR unit does is that will take the element width, which in this example is 510 pixels. It will then take away any existing content we have. So today we've got 100 pixels and 50 pixels. So it takes away 150 pixels. Then takes into account any gaps that we've got. This is one of the places where Grid is great because it knows the gap is only between columns, not the same as the number of columns. So we've got a 20 pixel gap between 4 columns, which means the gap is going to equal 60 pixels. Then takes into account how many FR units are defined in the grid. We've got 1 FR and 2 FR, so it would divide that by 3. Anybody following along? Anyone able to do maths at this point in the afternoon? 1 FR equals 100 pixels. What this would then do is it would go, so this grid template columns would be 100 pixels, 100 pixels, 50 pixels, 200 pixels. The 1FR gets 100 pixels and the 2FR gets 200 pixels because it's twice as wide. So if we go back to the code that I defined earlier, we said here repeat 5 1FR, 5 columns, 1FR. So they should all be the same width, but they're just going to take up whatever room is left over in the grid, which at the moment is all of it. Now, if we have a look at what that does to our app, you can see there we're starting to get 5 columns. We've only got 4 elements, so it's not actually filling all of them, but they're overflowing at the bottom, which is a bit of a pain. If we then go back to our wireframe, we're going to have a look at how many rows we're having. So again, we had one fixed height, one taking up as much room as it needed, and then a fixed height at the bottom. So we're going to use grid template rows to define that. So we've got a 100 pixel high header, 1FR, so that's going to take up whatever room is left over, and then a 20 pixel high footer. This doesn't have too much of an effect on our app because we're not even taking up the full first row, so it's not even flowing down into the bottom ones. Next, we're going to start putting our elements in our grid. And to start off, we're going to place the header. To tell the header where it's going to go, first of all, we're going to tell it where to start. And we're going to use grid column start 1. Now, this uses the lines of the grid, which, again, if you can read my writing, there's a reason I use computers. We want it to start right at the start, which is at line 1. You can see here each of our lines are numbered all the way across from 1 to 6. Yes, I have counted properly. Good. That would have been embarrassing. But, sorry. What our grid also does is it then counts backwards. So this is really useful. So we want our header to start at 1, but we want it to go all the way across at the end. So we can say we want it to go to 6, but then if our size of the grid changes, we've got to change that. So instead, we can say we want it to go from 1 to -1, which is always going to be that end line over there. So we say grid column end -1. So 1 to -1. Start at this side, go all the way to the other side, no matter how many columns wide our grid is. There's also a shorthand for this one as well, so we can just say grid column 1 or -1. There's a lot of different ways we can define where these are going as well, and we can also simply just say grid column span 5. What that does is it says I want you to span 5 columns and just put it wherever. But today we're going to just use grid column 1 -1. So if we do that, our header has now taken up the full width of the top row of our grid. You can see it started to push the elements down into our second row. Next, we're going to place the nav. So that's our yellow sidebar. And to do that, the nav, it only takes up 1 column, but we do want it to span 2 rows. So we're going to define grid row span 2, and we'll let the grid just place that wherever it goes, but we know it's just going to sit there. So you can see the nav has now dropped down into the bottom row of the grid as well. Then we're going to place the main body of content. And to do that, we're going to say grid column span 4. So this is where the main note section of our app is. We want that to span 4 columns to take up the rest of the second row. That's then pushed the footer down onto the bottom. And you can see that the footer's gone down onto the second column of the bottom row because the nav's taken up the first column. And lastly, we're going to make the footer take up the rest of the grid to nicely complete the box, like a really, really spectacular game of Tetris. We're going to say footer, grid column, span 4, and that one has now spread out to take the full rest of the bottom row. as I said, there's a lot of different ways that you can do it, and one of the great things about Grid is we can also define named areas. We do this using grid template areas. So you can see here we've got our columns and our rows that we've just defined. We can also define areas, and so you can see here we've got 3 rows, one line for each row, and 1 word for each column in our grid. This is really useful for creating responsive layouts where things will change across different device sizes because it reduces the code you need to write when things switch around. So here we want the header to be the full top row, we want the nav to take the first column of the second and third row, note should take up the rest of the second row, and footer should take up the rest of the third row. We then assign a grid area to each of our elements. For example, header is grid area header, main is grid area note, nav is grid area nav. Naming's really, really hard. And footer is grid area footer. What this does is looks exactly like we had it before. This is where I want to give a call out to Firefox developer tools. When you're getting started with Grid, I highly recommend using Firefox dev tools because they've got a really great grid inspector, which makes it super useful for using things like named areas. So you can see here, you can see an overlay on each section for what I've named the area. You can see where all of the different lines are. And there's a lot of really interesting tools which are super useful for helping to work out why your grid is doing what it is and not what you think it should be doing. So if you're using this, make sure you're checking out Firefox dev tools. So we've done a basic layout. That one's done. And we've done 7 lines of CSS. Did anybody actually think that was possible? But if we go back to our wireframe, this isn't exactly what we wanted our app to look like. So we actually wanted the note to take up most of the middle section, and then it had a little sidebar on the side, which isn't what it's doing right now. Now, we could just take away the main element and let these sit on their own, or we could define another grid, which gets complicated because you've got to then make sure it's fitting when the different grid changes. But instead, we can use a property that Grid gives us access to, which is display contents. Now, you apply display contents to a child of a grid, like our main element. What it does is it has a look at our HTML. Here we've got a main element, and inside that main element is an article and an aside element. And what display contents does is it kind of makes the main element disappear. So the article and the aside element now become grid children in their own right. So if we apply display contents to the main element, it no longer exists in the grid. And so now our article and our aside elements have taken up empty spaces in our grid. What we can then do is we can reassign our grid template areas, and instead of the note taking up the full second row, it just takes up 3 columns, and our sidebar takes up the final column in our layout. We then assign article and assign the grid areas of note and sidebar. And this pushes our note to take up 3 columns and our sidebar to sit at the end. Now, this seems like a really great thing to do and something you could go back and do, but I just want to add a disclaimer. So there's a bug. And so it is something that isn't supposed to happen. But in some browsers, when you apply display contents to an element, it, for example, our main element, it makes the whole thing disappear to screen readers, including children. So what display contents is meant to do is make the main disappear and just see the children. But in some browsers, like Safari, it does that. It makes it all disappear, and it will still visually appear on the page, but if anybody's using a screen reader on certain browsers, they won't hear it. So for something like this, I'd say the note part is fairly important information and not something we want to disappear. There's a lot more information about why we shouldn't be using display contents. There's a really great article, which I will be tweeting out about right now, maybe a little bit early. So you can have a look at this one to find out a little bit more about the issues behind using that. Moral of the story is just don't mess with the DOM. However, there is a better way to do it. And this is where we have CSS SubGrid to the rescue. And this is really exciting because this only came out 4 weeks ago, and this is the first time I've gotten to talk about it. I was really worried it was going to come out tomorrow, just a day too late. I've been messaging people at Firefox on Twitter being like, can I just get access? I want to use this in a talk. But anyway, we're going to see it today. I don't know much about SubGrid. I've used it for a grand total of doing these next couple of slides, but not many people know right now. So you're going to get to see it before a lot of other people. So if we have a look back at our app, this is what our app is looking like. And we want to take our grid template areas back to when the note took up the full width of the second row. We're not going to be having a sidebar there. What we're going to do, so that was when it looked like that. What we're going to do is we're not going to apply display contents anymore. We're going to apply display grid. But this isn't necessarily going to be a grid in its own right. So if we apply display grid, looks like this. It's taken up the full width. But then what we're going to do is, instead of defining how many columns wide we want our grid to be, as I said, we could just say, well, we want this grid to be 4 columns wide and sort that out, but then there's a lot of other work you've got to do when it changes screen sizes. SubGrid allows us to go grid template columns SubGrid. What this does is that will then take into account how many columns the element spans, and that then becomes the columns in the grid. So you can see here, this is what happened when we use display contents. The article has taken up a column, and the aside has taken up a column within that. What we can then do is we can say article grid column span 3, and that one then takes up the full width. What this will do is this will make sure that our main element is keeping within our main overall grid, even though these article and aside are grandchildren of the grid. This is really exciting, something we've been wanting for a while. If you're looking for more information on SubGrid, Mozilla DevDocs, great place to go and have a look. And there's also a fantastic article by Rachel Andrew where she goes to a bit more information and has a few demos. So one of the questions everybody asks with Grid is, does it replace Flexbox? Does it mean I just shouldn't use Flexbox, I should use Grid everywhere, or should I learn Flexbox, or should I just learn Grid? Now, let me ask you a question. Batgirl's pretty kick-ass, right? She's pretty amazing. Black Canary also kicks ass. She's also pretty amazing. Do we question whether or not we only need one or not the other? No! They form a super duper crime fighting duo. CSS Grid is really awesome for layouts, and Flexbox is really awesome for flowing content. Therefore, Grid and Flexbox form a super CSS layout duo. CSS Grid does do everything Flexbox does, but sometimes it's a little bit overkill. Grid and Flexbox work really well together, and I recommend using both of them because they both have a place. It's really useful being able to just use the two of them. I use Grid for overall layouts, but if it comes to something like a nav or vertically centering something, I'm just always going to go to Flexbox. So Flexbox is really useful for things like our footer nav, which if we have a look at this, our footer nav in the bottom is a little bit all bunched up. You can't really see the words there. So what we're going to do is we're going to apply display flex to our footer nav. And then we're going to use a Flexbox property called justify content. And we're going to set that to space between. What that says is justify content looks at the main axis, which in this case is going to be across, and we go, we want you to put space between each of the items, make them all nice and equally spaced out. Which does this. Lots of space between them now. Now, one of the other things that Grid does, so Grid has access to similar properties, justify items and align items. And by default, they're set to stretch. So if you've noticed in our grid, everything stretches to take up the full space it has available, even though we haven't set width and height on them. Most of the time for this is what we're wanting to do, but we don't really want our footer to take up the full width. We just want it to take up as much space as it needs. Now the justify and align items properties will assign it for all of the children, but then we also have access to justify self and align self. So this is where we can just define that on a particular grid child. So we can say footer justify self start. Justify in the x-axis, just go at the start instead of stretching all the way to the end. And that is then just going at the start. It's not taking up the full space, even though it has it available. But we're back to having it all squished up together. We do want to have a little bit of space between everything. So I am going to set a width to this. And so I'm going to say width 300 pixels, and this will make the footer take up a little bit more room and have a little bit more space between each of the items. Now, if I take away all of my beautiful backgrounds to make it easier to see on the screen, it's not bad. Probably not ready for production yet. Probably not something anybody would pay for. But considering how much code we've written, that's pretty good. We've got the general layout of an app. But this also isn't quite good enough. We also want to, this is fine while we've only got 3 notes, but we want to have a larger overview where we can see all of our notes. And so we're going to create a grid layout where we can see them all at once. So we're going to start off defining our grid template columns again for this view. And so we want, say maybe 10 across. So we're going to use our repeat function, so we're not having to write 300 pixels 10 times. And so we can, but we also then don't know if we can fit 10 across the whole screen. Another thing Grid gives us access to is a property called autofill. What that says is just fit in as many as you can. So, for example, I could say repeat autofill 100 pixels. So make each element 100 pixels wide and just fit in as many as you can. Autofill comes with a similar property, autofit, and so you can use one or the other here. There is a autofill will fill the row with as many columns as it can fit in, even if you're not going to need them all. Autofit fits the currently available columns, so however however many elements you currently have, and then we'll expand them to take up extra space. This is a really great CodePen demo by Sarah Sueden, which is a great explanation of how the two work, or you can just do what I do and switch between the two of them until the code seems to do what I want it to do. Which is why I've had to read the description from my notes, because I still don't remember properly. So if we have a look back, we were looking at autofill. Does anybody remember which one that was? As many as you can, even if we don't need them. So we were looking at grid template columns, autofill, 300 pixels. As many columns as you can, even if we don't need them, and they should be 300 pixels wide. But we also don't necessarily want any empty space if there's like 200 pixels left over. And this is where we can use the minmax function. Now, minmax allows us to define a minimum and a maximum. And so we can say it must be at least 100 pixels wide, but it can go up to 20 viewport widths wide. Again, we can use whatever units we want here. Ems, rems, pixels, points, viewport widths, viewport heights, percentages. The FR unit we learnt before. So for example, you can say 100 pixels wide, but go up to 1 FR. So they're going to be at least 100 pixels wide, but then they'll spread up to take any extra space if it's available, because you can't fit in a whole new column. But we were looking at, you can also have 1 FR 300 pixels. So you can say take up all of the space, but don't get bigger than 300 pixels. So that's what we wanted. We wanted it to be at least 300 pixels wide, but take up any extra space that's available, go up to 1 FR, which does that. You can see we've now got columns, and you can see there's a gap at the end. They haven't spread to take up more room because there is room for more columns there. We then want to define rows because we don't want them to take up the full height, and so we're going to use grid template rows. And again, we're going to use repeat autofill, as many as we can, even if we don't need them, and we just want these to be 150 pixels high. So now we've got a nice little block. But these are also pretty squished together. We want to have a gap between all of the different blocks. And so if we want to have a gap between each of the columns, we can use grid column gap, 20 pixels. Then if we want to have a gap between each of the rows, we can say grid row gap, 20 pixels. Or if you're wanting to have an equal one, you can just say grid gap, 20 pixels. So that says you want to have 20 pixels between each column and between each row. But why is it better to use grid gap than, say, using a margin? Well, it's because margins end up looking like this. I have to put negative margins on the parent because otherwise all of the children are going to be in 10 pixels. And trust me, the designers will see. 1 pixel different, the designer will see it. Or I get to do this really great thing where I can go, well, put a margin of 10 pixels around each child, but then the first 5, no, every 5th one doesn't get a margin to the right because they're on the right, and then all of every 5th one plus 1, all of the ones on this side don't get a margin to the left because they're on the left, and then the first 6 don't have a margin on the top, and then the last ones don't have a margin. And then in the next media query, I get to try and reset all of this and define it for my new amount of columns. Or I can just do that. So grid gap takes into account all of those extra things, so it makes it much easier. Don't use margins anymore. It's a nightmare. So we have a look. We've got a nice little gap between each of our items there. That's pretty good. Now, again, we're going to have a look at one of the great features of the CSS Grid Inspector with Firefox DevTools is you can start to see that grid being overlaid as well. We can see where the gap is, and we can see that we actually have these rows and columns even though we don't need them, because remember we used autofill. So it's made those spaces in our grid even though we don't need them. Again, if we take away all of my pretty colors, this is not bad. Okay. I added fonts and some colors and padding, so there is some other CSS, but this is most of our layout we've done. This all sounds pretty good. What's the catch, right? Surely there's not going to be a... Yeah. So, browser support is actually much better than you would expect. So what are we actually looking at? Okay, Chrome has had it since version 57. Firefox has had it since 52. Safari has had it since 10.1. Edge has had it since 16. That's all the... So Internet Explorer has had CSS Grid since version 10. Sort of. So Internet Explorer was actually the first browser to have CSS Grid. Way back when we started first talking about it, Internet Explorer started implementing the spec. However, it's changed a lot since then. And so the spec that IE has is really different from the one everybody else has. If you really want to, or like if you're really bored or having trouble sleeping or really want to procrastinate, you can still find that spec and have a read through to see what IE is actually doing, see whether or not that's going to work for you. But chances are it probably won't. So for the most part, IE doesn't support grid, but it kind of thinks it does. So what do these numbers actually mean? Well, for Europe, you're looking at about just over 91% usage. If anybody saw Lemon's talk earlier where he went through the stats, he was actually showing you the US usage. Unlike him, I remember the fact that there are countries other than the US. It's really exciting because he's actually at the back now. Thought he was going to miss it. So you're looking at fairly decent browser usage, browser support. However, SubGrid, you know that really exciting thing that I said we had? Firefox Nightly is the only browser to currently support that. Not even Firefox Dev version, only Firefox Nightly. So not really something you can actually use in production. Sorry I didn't mention that earlier. In my defense, the first time I learned about Grid was at a conference 3 or 4 years ago, and they didn't tell us that it wasn't actually out yet until at the end of the day. This is coming. It's going to come soon. But for now, you can just learn about it and be ahead of the curve. So download Firefox Nightly and have a play around with that. Looking at Flexbox usage, Chrome has had it for a while, same with Firefox, Safari, Edge, and IE supports Flexbox all the way back to 10. So that's pretty good. For Europe, you're looking at about 97.6% support, which is pretty good. I mean, those 2.4% of people probably aren't used to websites looking nice anyway because they're still using Internet Explorer 6. One of the great things about using new CSS, though, is we have access to our supports query, which if you're not familiar with the CSS supports query, similar to a media query, it allows us to define a CSS property and a value, and we can then put code inside of it. And if a browser doesn't know what to do with a property and a value, it won't process the code. Supports is a fairly new thing. So yes, some browsers don't support it, but the great thing is if a browser doesn't support supports, it's not going to support grid anyway. And if a browser doesn't know what to do with a supports query, it's just going to ignore the code in there anyway. So you can, for example, say supports display grid, put your grid code inside of that, and if a browser doesn't know what to do with display grid, won't process your code. This is really great because it means we're not delivering unsupported CSS to browsers. We're not going to have anything janky. However, you know what I said before about this guy? IE has a really old version of grid spec. So you go give it a supports query that says display grid. It goes, oh, I can do that. I can do it. I know what to do here. I got this. But it doesn't. The rest of the properties, it goes, I don't know what to do with that one. Or I think I do this. It doesn't really know what it's doing. Again, if you read the original spec that IE has implemented, if you really, really want to, you can work out whether or not you might just be able to get away with implementing that kind of grid on your website. Or you can just do a supports query for a property IE won't know what to do with. For example, I test for grid template areas. I don't actually have to define a bunch of areas. I can just say dot, and IE looks at that and goes, no clue what you're doing. And so it's really great because I can go grid template areas, use display grid, and IE is just going to ignore it altogether, which is exactly what I want to happen. So surely it can't possibly get any better than this, right? CSS Grid 2.0 is coming. So for the most part, CSS Grid 2.0 is SubGrid, which I mentioned before, which is available on Nightly. You can download it and play with it tonight. It's really fun to use something so new. But there are a few other different things coming with that as well. So that's going to be a couple of changes to Grid, which is going to make it even better. But I know what you're all thinking. You're going to go back to work and you're going to go, we should use Grid. I heard this really amazing talk and we should use this. And everybody's going to say, but. So I'm going to give you something you can take back to work. So what's something people are going to say? But there's not enough support. 91.606%. Really depends on your workplace, but that's pretty decent support if you ask me. And we've got our supports query. So we're not giving Grid to a browser that doesn't know what to do with it. People are going to say, well, but then we've got to write a fallback for the other browsers. You've already got one. Your layout isn't currently using Grid. That's your fallback. Write Grid code inside of a supports query, and any new browsers will get the Grid layout. But we don't have time to do that. So the secret is you don't actually have to use Grid everywhere. You can go back, implement Grid, one place, one section of your application. You don't have to use it everywhere. Gradually roll it out to different parts of your website. Use it somewhere, let people get used to it, and gradually work your way through. But then we'll have to maintain it. So how many people here use Bootstrap at work? Guess what? CSS Grid is CSS. It's not a framework. It's just CSS. It is so much easier to maintain than any framework like Bootstrap or something else that you're using because you don't have to update it. I think I heard something about Bootstrap 4 broke a bunch of things, and no more node modules to update. You can just have your CSS. It's so much easier to maintain than whatever you're using now. So when you go back to work, make sure you've got all of these arguments so that you can tell your boss that they're wrong and you should be using grid. So to sum up, that's all I covered, right? That was the important points. CSS Grid is amazing. CSS Grid is awesome. It's a game changer for layout. It's something we should all be using, even if it's just in one section of your application, even if it's just going to browsers that know what to do it. We need to be using it. We need to get out in front of these changes. So go back, tell your work that they're awesome. That was it. Use Grid. So there's a bunch of different resources out there to help you use Grid. It's great because it's a new shiny thing, so everybody's talking about it. One that I highly recommend, CSS Tricks, has the complete guide to Grid. This is a lifesaver. By the way, I'm tweeting out these links as well. Like, you feel free to take photos and share them, but these will be available on Twitter afterwards. This is kind of, I think I kind of stuff up the CSS Tricks stats for Perth, particularly when I was writing this talk and continually having to go back and have a look at this page. It's a lifesaver. If you're wanting to start from scratch learning Grid, there's a really great free online course, cssgrid.io. This is by Wes Boss, if you're familiar with any of his JavaScript tutorials. If you're someone who doesn't like watching video tutorials, I recommend having a look at this one anyway. I hate doing video tutorials, and I really like these courses. It's free. You really can't lose. If you're a little bit old-fashioned, no, I'm not making fun of you. I have this book. I have the physical copy of the book, not even an ebook. There's a really great book, CSS Layout by a Book Apart. It's by Rachel Andrew. That's a good one to have a look at. Pretty much anything by Rachel Andrew is a good resource for Grid. She was one of the really important people helping to build this spec. So pretty much anything she's written, any of her talks are great Grid information. Also anything by Jen Simmons, who works for Mozilla. She was also a really heavy pusher behind CSS Grid coming out. There's also fun ways to learn about it. You can have a look at CSS Grid Garden, which is a really fun way to learn about using Grid and makes your boss look at you weird because you told him that you were doing work and you're playing a game on your computer. If you're wanting to find out more about Flexbox, the guy who built Grid Garden also made Flexbox Froggy, so you can learn about them both at the same time. Thank you very much for coming along to my talk. If anybody has any questions, I will be around for the rest of the conference. Feel free to come up and ask me any questions, to tell me I'm wrong, or to bring your boss up to try and convince you to use Grid. If anybody is brave enough to ask questions here, though, I do have Australian chocolates if anyone would like to ask in front of anybody. Were there any questions? People are already leaving, though. Did anybody have any questions?
Or rather have like bigger parts and down the grid and Flexbox inside, or is it like everybody is doing it differently?
everybody's doing it differently. So one of the great things about Grid is we're not stuck with a 12-column layout. If anybody missed that bit about 12-column layout, it can be. You can have 1 column, you can have 4, you can have 12, you can have 50. Probably the best person to work out what would work well for you is your designer, because they're going to be the ones who are designing how that layout's going to work. It's really a case of working out what works best for you and preferably getting everybody in your team to do the same thing. Come on, I tried throwing last time and I think I almost heard people just come up afterwards. Were there any other questions? Yeah.
So you had a 5-column grid, but the 3 columns in the middle were always the same. Could you instead have had a 3-column grid where the width of the middle column was 3FR, I guess?
So someone actually picked that up in my practice session. I was like, it's fine. No one's going to ask that. Yes, I could have. I don't know. I think I don't actually remember the logic behind why I made them 5 columns. Yes, I probably could have. Probably would have been easier. There's a bunch of different ways I could have done it and still had it look exactly the same way. There's one of the great things about Grid is you can do it however you want. Yep.
So you have an at support for adding a grid CSS.
Yep.
That would actually not take out the CSS that would potentially crash with the grid system. Do you have an at not support?
A lot of people ask that. The problem with an at not supports is if the browser doesn't support the supports query, it's not gonna do that. Unfortunately, there is some CSS that you're gonna have to reset inside of that supports query as you're defining the grid code. So that's something to take into consideration. Yeah, unfortunately, that's not an easy way around it. It just depends on, hopefully, your existing code isn't too complicated and there's not too much to reset.
Are there any traps with media queries and making it flexible in that way?
No, none whatsoever. So I have used Grid both with and without media queries. I've used it where I was changing the way the grid laid out in different media queries. And then, for example, things like my blog, I just went, nah, fit as many columns as you can. And that just makes the whole thing responsive. But yeah, it works really well inside media queries. No issues there. The great thing is you have to write less of them. Any more questions? Thank you very much, everybody, for coming along. Yeah, feel free to come up and pester me afterwards. Oh, also, I have stickers. If anybody wants to come up and get stickers.